Usually you do those slides too.
If not, you'll see stick.
She's like,
For you.
I don't have you. She's she's older, a little older. She's got
Where I think speak is going to be has to
okay.
because the photographer's coming soon to get that. She's got the sign has to be behind his knee.
Yes.
You know what I mean? No, I understand. Well, she's like perfectly normal.
Okay. About anything different?
No, I don't know. She's not excited. Jen, or what does Jen look like? What does Jen look like?
Just do.
Yeah. Eric.
I think I know.
Oh, no, she's not a picture of her.
Just see how the sort of audio studio possibly. Okay, great. Sorry, you was on this slide.
USB stick.
Yeah, I really can.
Give me. Oh, yeah.
Which I
It's like, no, wait.
Hi.
No, look at me.
Which one?
SLARI'S, okay, then you go.
I've got a lot of PDFs.
Okay, hold on. Cabo IGC, which one is 20? Which one? Yeah, try this one.
That one? Oh, you should.
No, let's see it first. Is it number? Yeah, that's the one. Revised number 1.
Okay.
Okay, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the revised one.
It's an off the rack super.
Yep.
Just tailored.
Something I think.
So then the second time it came back.
Okay, thank
Great.
you. Yeah, make sure we have R.
Sorry?
Rev 1.
Yeah.
Revised one.
Yeah.
It was like pretty embarrassed because he basically told me that if you went with anything, like it'd be fine. One thing, absolutely. Right, I look like a normal person. So then he was like, sure, and he was wondering whether the tailor had messed up. And he went, and he was like, okay, just stay there, I'm going to go get my head tailor to come out. At which point this Eastern European woman walked over and adjusted me, pushed me around a bit, put me in, okay, stand properly, stand okay. And she went, she turned to me and she said, the suit isn't the problem, your body is the problem. No kind of charm, no like, no, your body is the problem. So I have one shoulder, apparently it's dropped lower than the other one, which you know I never knew. It can be to do with the sports injury, but perhaps not to do with so I found this out. This is a useful thing to find out if you go in my expensive suit. Liberia, of all places. At least you know moldy. That's something that I don't know. So, clothes are moldy in Liberia. Just because of the humidity. I mean, have you been to the Serena in July? I mean, it's the big hotel in anyway, I mean, my guess is this is probably true in every major I just was I don't have this question about hotel. Right, exactly. It's okay. But the Serena was amazing. This is luxury paradise. Flowing. Amazing green palms everywhere.
I think Nerica and school
I think that's true, but more like
Sierra Leone cruise. Oh, it's coming later. But some people do move back to China. Yours, how is it going? So, I don't know how to grade it. And all I you would want to do is you want to go first? Yep. Okay, so we'll just jump in after you start.
Oh, yes.
So we can already join you take 15 to 20 minutes of your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll hear it officially for the first time. And where's the microphone?
So who's first?
So there is no microphone.
Richard, you want to go first?
Okay, that's good. That was good practice. There was no concern. Yeah, the functionality, if it is not what it is, that should be the stuff on the file.
Good afternoon.
By the way, presentation.
Yeah, good afternoon. We're going to start. We have a couple of we have a version of sessions. You are not one yet. Yes. Thank you all for coming. My name is McLeod, Herbert McLeod. I am the country director of the Sierra Leone. Today we're going to talk about research work that's been going on in agriculture, and we have two people who will employed. We have Professor Nerica, who is the academic director for Sierra Leone, and we have Dr. Joseph Kabo, who is the newly appointed director of Agricultural Research Institute in Sierra Leone. He's been quite associated with the work of IGC since now 2 years. So we now have a hidden armor inside the administration. We'll start with Rachel, who is really good introduction, and she will tell you about some of the research work that we've done.
Great. I'm going to try and do a quick overview of quite a lot of different work that's been done on agriculture in Sierra Leone, and then I'll go out to one study in Kenya which sort of tried to do almost the same thing that was tested in Sierra Leone in Kenya, and see some differences. So it's going to be quite tight to get in. I'm going to present results of basically 4 or 5 studies. So just to give you a little bit of background, we're talking mainly about an agricultural sector that is smallholder farmers in an environment that is land abundant and labour scarce. Rice is the main staple crop. 87% of farmers grow rice. There is important cash crops, including cocoa and palm oil. And if you come to the Ebola session tomorrow, one of the issues there is that it's exactly the cash crop area which is being hit particularly badly there. Within rice, though, most of what I'm going to talk about is about rice, although a little bit on cash crops. Rice yields are very low, lower even than other places in sub-Saharan Africa, and much, much lower than other places around the world. And you don't, in a sense, have to look too far to understand why that's the case. Very few farmers use improved seeds. Very few farmers use fertilizer. There's little irrigation or mechanization, and so most of this data comes from a nationally representative survey of smallholder farmers that Herbert was involved in commissioning from us or working with us when he was part of government. I was involved in collecting some of the data, and IPA and Andrews here was worked with the statistics agency to do. So that's sort of where we get these national figures from. But in more detailed work that we've done in a randomized study, we're seeing very high failure rates, even in our area of rice. The other thing that I think is really important in terms of to have in your mind is the pronounced seasonality of production and prices. So, and with that goes pronounced seasonality in eating. So we talk about hunger season, and that's very literally true in that people cut back what they're eating in the summer months. And we see August is the time when most people run out of stocks of the previous year's harvest, and this is when domestic rice prices are high, and you see a sudden collapse in these rice prices just after harvest. And this seasonality is something that you see even in more developed markets, even more integrated markets, even though we have a lot of evidence that markets are much less integrated in Sierra Leone than they are in some other countries. So these are the 4 studies I'm going to talk about. There's one about cocoa, which talks about the interlinked transactions that happen along the supply chain in cocoa. There's one about palm oil, so another cash crop, and work that I've done on high yield short duration rice and road rehabilitation. So, and as you can see from that, I'm a little on 2 of these, but not all of of them, so, you know, don't take this as, you know, don't give me the credit for all of this work. But I'm going to try and put it into kind of what I see as what we learned from about the overall system from the set of work. So this is, while I'm talking about cocoa, the first couple of bullet points probably, and maybe all of them, also apply to other crops in Sierra Leone. There's very little access to formal financial sector, and because if you remember, people have this, you know, they've run out of rice from the previous harvest, they're not eating very much, so they're desperate to borrow in that hungry season. And so the traders will provide credit during that season, and they will use it to lock in, you know, they will often tie it to then, if I provide you credit, you're going to sell to me. So in cocoa, they find, in this paper, they find that 65% of farmers had received loans in the past 12 months from traders, and that the traders use that to lock in supply. So they want to have access to that cocoa when it's ready, and a lot of them are providing loans to farmers. So there's not formal credit, but this kind of informal credit that's linked to the providers, to the traders. So in this experiment, what they did was they randomized at the level of trader, and they gave 150 leones more per pound for high-quality cocoa. And while on the international markets, high-quality cocoa gets a price premium, for most farmers there is no quality premium for high-quality cocoa. So it's just that international price differential is not feeding down to the farmers. So they wanted to say, well, if we incentivize traders to get high-quality cocoa, what would happen? And the first thing that they found was there's no pass-through of price. In that the farmers did not then receive more money for high-quality cocoa. But they did receive more loans. So instead of passing on the benefit to farmers by paying them more for high-quality cocoa, they passed it, the traders used that money to make more loans to farmers. And part of the rationale for that is that the loans are then used to get that higher quality, because one of the things that you do, and Joe knows this much better than me, but my understanding is that you can dry it better, dry it for longer, keep it for longer, and therefore this immediate rush, I've got to get money, well, if I've got a loan, I can hold on to it and get better quality from that. Interestingly, sort of the rationally efficient thing to do if we had a really good market going is if you've incentivized some traders and not others, those traders should have gone around and cream-skinned all the high quality in all villages. That is not what they did. They went back to their same villages and tried to get the farmers to work harder and keep their crop longer to make it higher quality. So that must be, presumably, because they can't break into other villages that are not their villages. So what do we learn from this? We learn that cocoa quality can be improved with more investment. That working through, one policy conclusion potentially might be that you can use traders as a way to get credit out. So if you're a government who's finding it hard to reach farmers, there are traders who are already doing those kind of relationships and teaching them how to get better quality and providing credit. Maybe you want to use traders. But it's a double-edged sword. These farmer-trader relationships are a double-edged sword because the value of this relationship means that they can provide this enforceability of contract. Normally the worry about providing loans is that you would get side selling. You give the loan and then they just sell it to someone else. Well, they're sufficiently powerful, their relationship is sufficiently powerful that they know the farmer's going to sell to them, but in a sense that then undermines competition, and that may be why we're seeing the price fall at harvest, because they have to sell it to the guy that they've made the deal with. So it reduces competition, and we'll see in the next study, it makes it hard to innovate because all the supply is already locked up. Of a more technical level for researchers, you can't just assess pass-through by looking at price, because they may well be giving the pass-through value in other forms. So I now want to move to the next puzzle, which is, we already started to talk about, is this very big difference in price. At harvest time it's very low and then it creeps up over time. That's not as economists we would expect someone to come in and arbitrage that. Well, why isn't that arbitrage working? Well, it might be that there's not enough storage, or rather that you have some kind of monopoly, somebody has monopoly on storage. It could just be that the product deteriorates rapidly, and people have tried to tease this out in other contexts, and it could just be that, rats get the rice or get into their maize. But we're going to look at, therefore, Lorenzo, who did this work, looked at palm oil, which doesn't deteriorate, and he still sees that price differential. It could be, from the farmer's side, lack of access to credit, they have to sell at harvest time. Another issue that people have looked at in this in Indonesia, I think, is irrationality on the farmer's side, a sort of very heavy present discounting that they really want the money now. Again, though, that should be solved if even a few people don't have, this is what's the real puzzle is, that even a few people have access to credit and have access to storage and aren't exponential discounters, they should be able to smooth out the price fluctuations. Unless there's some monopoly provider, some monopoly in the system. So Lorenzo looks at a scheme that helps solve this problem for farmers by providing credit at harvest time for the storage of palm oil, as I say, that doesn't deteriorate over time, so it's sort of a really clean thing to look at. And you still get seasonal price differential of 30 to 60%. Now, something that's important to note here is we're talking about farmers who've had very little previous exposure to banks. So he finds, this is a randomized experiment with storage only, credit and storage, using the palm oil as collateral, and then a control group. And while the farmers who invested in this product actually did quite well, the take-up was quite low, and it only displaced storage, other kinds of storage. So the revenue, because the take-up was low, while it was good for those who took up the product, very few people took it up, and it wasn't very profitable for the banks because they didn't get enough take-up to cover their costs. So why did we say low take-up? So the hypotheses are that these people have never dealt with banks before, so they're very suspicious of the banks coming in and offering this credit. But I think also, as we talked about in the cocoa study, and what we're seeing again and again coming up is this relationship with the trader, and the anecdotal stories that were heard in these was don't commit to sell your rice with the bank. Don't take the loan from the bank because they may not be here next year. I'm the one who has bailed you out over the last 10 years in hungry season. I'm going to be here next year. Don't mess with this new product. So it can be very hard to break in even with a product that is successful. Interestingly, almost identical study was run in Kenya, and it was very successful and so instead of giving 70% of the revenue at the time of harvest, they gave 100% of the harvest price for this loan. In Sierra Leone, the interest rate was 22%. In Kenya, it was 10%. And the farmers already had a relationship with these banks, and they get 70% take-up. So much, much higher take-up. And the farmers who were offered these loans sold less at harvest and more later. And even though the normal price rise over after the months of harvest, prices rose less than any time in the last 10 years, they still made a 20% who invested use this storage product. So the next study is a study I'm involved in, which is on high-yielding rice. And we look at the nutritional impact of that, this Sierra Leone has very high levels of malnutrition. We look at Nerica, a new rice that combines Asian and African rice, and ROC, which is named after the research station that Joseph is part of, the group under Joseph's command. And we randomize the price to introduce, and we randomize whether people get training as well. And we see, take up of full price of 20%, but if you give it away for free, everyone will take up. Maybe unsurprising. And what we're finding is that the harvest comes about a month earlier for Nerica farmers. They buy less imported rice, and they get about 16% higher yields overall over their entire rice farm. Only about a quarter of it is Nerica rice. But they only get that with training. And this was absolutely stunning for me, because nothing else that I've seen has shown such a big effect of training. And we also see training being very important with ROC, which is very surprising, because ROC is, the benefit of ROC is it's very similar to the traditional rice, and which makes me think that maybe if we run training on its own, it would have been positive. But unfortunately, we did not do that. So the training we did was very expensive, so it's not something that I would recommend we take up. We've got to look, the next stage is to look at a very scalable training intervention. But this, I think, is important, which is we actually see malnutrition of children fall in the areas that had the new rice seed. So we see improvements in BMI and in weight for age. I don't have a lot of time to go over our road study. I think the main takeaways from the road study is that, first of all, a lot of government expenditure on agriculture goes on roads, and yet we really don't know very much about the returns for roads. It was a regression discontinuity design. We saw that the roads that were improved had lower transport cost and faster transport time, and we see quite a complicated response to the roads in terms of market prices. And that is because trade economists sort of think of transport as simply all going from a central point, and actually in these markets, a lot of the trade is internal to just a local district. And so one of the things that roads do is it helps farmers get their product to market, in which case you would expect to see a fall in prices. But the other thing it does is it helps get traders from the town out to the markets, and then prices go up. And that's exactly what we see, which suggests that these are very thin markets with a lot of search costs for traders. So that's the only, we have a whole formal model in here, but the only thing that's compatible with our results is this sort of high search cost for traders. So how do I try and put all of this work together? So I think there's enormous potential for improving productivity in agriculture in Sierra Leone, which is absolutely fundamental to GDP and employment, and investing in it will have, it's pro-poor growth. We've got to, think really seriously about these pronounced seasonalities. Particularly, it's very bad for nutrition for people to be eating less for whole months of the year. Some of our standard, 101 economics doesn't follow when we have very thin markets, which is what we do here. And because of the thin markets and this hungry season, the people who can provide credit during that crucial time end up having an enormous amount of leverage. And the policy question that I still don't quite know how to advise the government on is, should we leverage that relationship to improve policy, use that relationship, drive policy down through the traders, or do we try and undercut them because they're stopping competition? And I think that's a really big question that I don't have the... But clearly anything that we do has to take into account the fact that these relationships are very strong. And that can act as a big barrier to introducing innovation. Thanks. I'm just going to pull yours up. Oh, this is yours, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so I just...
Good afternoon, everybody.
Okay. I'll just give an overview of agricultural research in Sierra Leone over the last century, where we are going, where things are now, and where we'll be going, and how these retail studies, what they are doing, fit into the framework that we have in Sierra Leone. So I give some background information on agriculture. The importance in the economy, it contributes between 32 and 56% to GDP, employs about 70% of population. Employment by gender, men 49, women 51. Poverty profile, poverty, 70% of population living in poverty in 2000. Now it's down to 53% in 2011. The incidence of poverty is highest among farmers. Agricultural share of government expenditures, 1922 to 1955, 0.88 to 3.13. Just after the war, 2001 to 2006, 2.5 to 3. 2009 to 2012, 6.16 to 8.87. Essential of agricultural research and policy. Government emphasis on national economic growth, increasing rural incomes, wealth creation, food security and poverty alleviation, promotion of agricultural exports. To facilitate the achievement of the above goals, agriculture sector must be transformed from a subsistence sector to a commercial and profitable business enterprise. Agriculture is viewed as the engine for economic growth in Sierra Leone, with a focus on agricultural value chains of input supply, production, value addition, agro-processing. Here we have agribusiness centers along the value chain. Marketing. Here it fits into what Rachel was talking about. We have to think about quality of the farm produce. Example, local rice, prices, price formation, packaging of price discovery and all the price dynamics. Consider issues dealing with financing farmers, market dynamics, and relationships along the agricultural value chain. Next, within that value chain, we have to look at the role of financing, credit facilities. Right now, the government is providing, we have financial services associations or village banks. Currently, we have about 51 of them around the country. The community banks, we have 17 across Sierra Leone. Very high interest rate, 2.5 per month, capped at 36 per year. So agencies are included. These are what the value, the agricultural value chain. We are included in the National Sustainable Agricultural Development Program, which led to the smallholder commercialization scheme and the medium and large-scale farmers promotion scheme. These are just a brief look at the various states, how research started in Sierra Leone, going all the way back from 1910, when the Injala experiment station was started, all the way to SLARI. Throughout time, some of these stations have changed their names and scope and the programs they address. Now, then we have SLARI established by Parliament in 2007. That's the one I'm heading now. So, what's the vision of SLARI? To improve and sustainable broad-based agricultural growth. SLARI adopted the agricultural value chain approach, which approach within the frameworks of integrated agricultural research for development and agricultural innovation systems to shift the focus from purely production of agricultural products up to processing, differentiation, and value addition of commodities to meet market demands and increase incomes and economic growth in rural areas. So here is the organization of all the research centers in Sierra Leone. So what they've done over time, they divided all the various sectors of the economy, like the ag sector. So for tuber crops, root tuber and grain legume crops, they set them under Injala Agricultural Research Center. The cereal crops are under Rukuper. That's where Rachel and her group, the team gets the Nerica rice, the rock series. That's basically a Rukuper series that they just give it in the acronym. Then we have the horticultural crops program, which is under, centered in Kabbalah, headquartered in Kabbalah, Northern Province. Livestock program, livestock research center, just after Makeni, and then it goes to Musaya. The fisheries program is set, headquartered at Kisi, just after, a suburb of Freetown. Then the forestry and tree crops program, this one is in Kenema, in the Eastern Province. And we are having serious problems here because of the Ebola. We can't even go to that center right now because the area is under quarantine. So we moved some of the staff just outside the district. Some of them are in Boa, some are in Freetown, And then we have the land, water, and environmental program. This is in Magosi, in the center of the country. So each of these centers have a director, a center director, who directly works on, under me, so that we try to coordinate all the research programs, in the country. So here, this table just gives a background or an outline of the arable land and the ecosystems in Sierra Leone. So we see the ecology of land. It accounts for 78% of the arable land in the country. Then we have the lowlands, which include inland valley swamps, mangroves, bonylands, riverines. So these are the share of the arable land, each of the ecosystem, its share of the arable land in the country. The current yields, for rice in each of the ecosystems, and the potential. So you see, in each area you go, you see how much we can really improve agriculture in Sierra Leone. Only 36% of the arable land is actually cropped, and it's all under cultivation in Sierra Leone. So we have huge tracts of land that are not farmed. So we have a lot of room to improve the agricultural systems. So that's how I've gone over that. Again, the average farm size is very small, 2.7 hectares. With maybe mechanization and everything, bringing new farming techniques, we may be able to increase that. 95% of the farmers, grow rice. Now, SLARI, the strategic plan of SLARI is in line within the national, regional, and global development perspectives, what we believe. Across Africa, they have this research architecture wherein SLARI sets its programs now to try to align them with the region, and then you go all the way into the global economy. In this way, we can streamline the programs, make effective use of resources. This is just a graph showing this is Sierra Leone agricultural sector. SLARI is here. So from here, these are all our programs, our work programs, then feed into the regional centers across Africa, then you go out. Recently, they did a gap analysis in research, resources, and financial analysis for SLARI. The reason they did that was to determine the optimal numbers of research scientists, field and laboratory technicians, and administrative staff. The current status of the research scientists is very weak. You know, we are a post-war, country just coming after the war. There was a lot of destruction. So we wanted to see what are the optimal, what's the optimal ratio of scientists to support, support staff. They came out with the number 1 to 6. So for every research scientist, we have, the optimal number is 6 supporting staff. But SLARI right now is way off the optimal expectations. Now, let's look at the research gaps within the agricultural product value chains. We need a better understanding of issues on financing farmers, markets, and relationships between operators within the value chain. As I remember, I gave you background just now, inputs, products, and all those things. The quality of the farm produce, except, for example, local rice versus imported, prices and other incentives. So we need to find out, go in detailed studies, what Nerica have done with our team, try to look at some of the gaps, and try to really find out how can we improve. She talked about the issue of resistance. All the incentives they were trying to provide for the farmers were not adopting. They were not, taking the programs. Currently, only 12% of the beneficiaries of community banks and financial services associations are farmers. Why? The money is there in the banks. The banks are willing, the village banks are willing to loan them, but the farmers don't take the loans. It comes down to the issue of the traders. They are stranglehold on these farmers. And that has been a recurrent problem. Because I remember when I was doing research way back in the 70s, and in the 80s when I was doing my master's program, my thesis is on financing rural farmers, on agricultural cooperatives. This was an issue that we had to deal with. So here is just SLARI'S operational plan. We require about 274 million from 2012 to 2016. We have a financing gap of 168 million. We need to find a way to cover it. Here are growth multipliers. This is chapter 9 of my book, which I wrote in 2011. I wanted to calculate, how can Sierra Leone really come up with estimates of, if we invest in agriculture, what do we expect? So I came up with, after doing a lot of modeling and simulation analysis and everything, we came up that if we invest 1 million in agriculture, it goes through the system, it yields 7.96 millions. So 1 million yields 7.96. But remember, you put in 1 million. So the net yield is 6.96. So you put in 1 million, you get a net of 7 millions. You round it up. The manufacturing sector, that 1 million you put in agriculture will generate 1.69 in the manufacturing sector, generate 1.05 in services, generate 3.77 in mining. You go through each of the sectors. These are based on national, these sectors, you look at all the sub-sectors, you can go in here, based on the national account. So I looked at, basically, I have over 100 years of data that I've collected over time and everything. So I went in and modeled this one. So we have what you can see that agriculture has a potential in the country to make, to change people's lives, economic growth, income generation, and everything. So, what are some of the issues that we have to deal with in order to achieve those potentials given us by the growth multipliers? We have some challenges that we face. The key strategic areas that will be the challenges, look at production and processing. Here are some of the things that we should think of. Lack of effective extension services. They will hold us back. Pests and diseases. Declining soil fertility. Under policies, institutions, and regulatory functions, poor governance and corruption. How do we make good use of our resources? Scarce resources, we got to pay attention to that. Value for money. Then lack of coherent policies and inappropriate legal and regulatory framework. You go natural resources, infrastructure, macroeconomic factors, and external environment. Macroeconomic instability, high levels of poverty, increasing incidence of drug abuse and diseases. Concluding comments. Convert challenges, constraints, crises into opportunities for effective governance and strategic development. Move new technology discoveries from experimental plots to farmers at a faster pace. Maximize funding from the government of Sierra Leone for SLARI'S. So these are some of my own views now. Yeah. If I'm going to go out and ask foreigners to fund my programs, I better hold my government accountable. They have to maximize their funding to the art sector. We've already discussed it with the ministers, and the president is aware of it. Okay? So seek funding from foreign government, international organizations, foundations, and other entities to make SLARI'S development plan operational. Involve training, human resource development and management, physical resource development, information, communication, and documentation. Increase proposal writing, so I encourage my staff. I told them, I'm going to be here for 5 years. Now you can be my friend, or you can be have a nightmare. You have to make a choice. If you're going to be here with me, I benefited from this system. I'm a product of the land grant university system in the United States. And they drill you to do this. You want to enjoy your education, your research in the system? Bring money. Publish. If you don't, you perish. So I tell them, if you want to stay here in SLARI'S, do this. And you'll be my friend. If you are not, see you. So develop partnership with domestic and foreign institutions. So here, I'm encouraging, I go around as I talk to people, we are open in SLARI'S. And I go to the government and encourage them, please accept researchers from here, all over the world. That's the only way the situation in Sierra Leone can change. You need help from the outside people to bring ideas, technology transfer, and all that. So open your minds up and see what we can do for the country. So I ask people to work closely with us. We are open. We are changing the mindset in Sierra Leone. Yes, before you may have bad experiences, but as we keep working, within the system, things are changing gradually. And of course, the government, so we asked them to give us, some land. We were expecting 10 acres, and guess what? We got 20. But now that we have the land, what are we going to do with it? I need $60 million to set up a first-class research center in Freetown and in other parts of the country. So when I said this, everybody, huh? We're going to get it. Because we started talking to people, and as I go around, travel around, I ask people, if you have any ideas that you think somebody may be interested in helping us, please let us know. But we are interested in getting this money. We can't, the government may do it, but it's going to take us a long time. I can't wait another 10, 20 years to do it. I need to raise the money to build this center. It's also good for each and every one of you here. If we have an excellent research center there, wouldn't you feel comfortable going to Sierra Leone to conduct your research? Self-interest. So let's work together and get this done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Joseph. I think the idea was for us to give you a flavor of the research gaps that still require a lot of work. Although Joe gave you a sort of bird's eye view, when you look at some of the work that has been done by IGC, just by IGC in the last couple of years, it's very difficult for a policymaker to just take one of them and move forward. So the idea behind this presentation is really to say, you know, there's been some excellent work, but we need to go the next step. So, questions, if you have questions for Rachel on the smallholders or on the research gaps. Yes, Eric.
So I was struck by the seasonality of pricing, and it seems like you said that there should be an arbitrage. I think it goes back to the Bible, right, where you buy. I don't know. I haven't read the Bible in a long time. But so the question is, how is this dealt with along the institutional spectrum in other places, where maybe at highest institutions the markets work to do this, and maybe back in the day you had wheat boards or cocoa boards or whatever that would kind of serve this role, but then they had these, you know, sort of, you had these negative political economy effects that came along with it. So I guess is there a role today in 2014 for a social enterprise or a nonprofit to just simply perform that role? And it would be as simple as finding the right management team and getting it done to buy low and sell high and then reinvest the profits in your headquarters. The second question. Once I'm thinking about the business idea, you asked for 10 acres, you got 20.
Yeah.
Can you monetize the other 10?
No, I'm not going to monetize it.
So right in downtown Freetown.
So I think this is, I mean, I seriously think this is a, you know, a real puzzle that has puzzled so many people, because it's not just in, you know, in Sierra Leone in a couple of crises. We see this seasonality of prices, even in much more developed countries. You know, not in really developed countries, but even in more developed countries. And it is, I mean, I don't think we have the answer to it. I mean, it is, in the Kenya example, when they provide this small-scale, the small-scale storage, they find that in the areas where they provide a lot of it, you actually see some dampening of the seasonality. So they see less dip at harvest. But that's kind of crazy to me, right? You would think that there would be enough big players who could come in and purchase. And I mean, one theory that people have, but anybody who does try and do this on a big scale actually finds it quite hard to break in because of these existing relationships. So, or they get bad quality, or, I mean, the other part of this is the search costs are very high.
Why can't you buy from the traders then?
So I should say there were many traders along this line, right? So there's the traders who are buying off the farmer, and then there's the traders who are selling in the markets, and then there were the traders who are coming from the town and buying from. So what the search cost we're talking about is the search cost for the guys coming from town, because they have to go all the way out there on really bad roads, and there's often not very much rice to market. So these markets are really thin. So actually exploiting this is quite hard. And Tristan Reed, who was on, you know, actually tried to work with a company who was going around and, you know, bought big trucks and wanted to go market to market and buy it all up and bring it to Freetown, and they would just arrive and not be able to buy very much. And it just wasn't worth their while to buy these small amounts of money, and these small amounts of. So I mean, that's one possible explanation.
The ROI is just too low.
Is that the search costs and the transport costs are quite hard. But it's and then, you know, in Kenya it's a much more dense market. The transport costs are much lower. You know, there's more that's sold. I mean, just remember, 10% of people are selling in this. I mean, it's really, really thin markets. So if you try and buy up everything and do that, you can easily drive up prices quite quickly. So this is I mean, none of this is proven, but from having seen all these projects, that's sort of my The other thing people have said is you potentially have expropriation risk. If you are the one big guy who goes and buys up and has a big store, you know, do you then, if people are starving or, you know, you're attacked for speculation? But you know, people have said to me in Sierra Leone, no, you know, nobody's ever been expropriated for holding large quantities of food. So,
Joe, do you want to add to this discussion, because our authorities in agriculture keep saying that, you know, there's all this production, but most of it is smuggled to Guinea. Or so that is inconsistent. I mean, if there's this huge amount, that's inconsistent with this difficulty in really being able to buy in bulk. Because you just raise the price, you save the guy smuggling it all the way to Guinea.
Yeah, well, it depends on what part of the country. You know, the smuggling, so I don't have a map of Sierra Leone. But if you look at the map of Sierra Leone, right? So you go northwest by, that takes you, you're very close to Conakry, you know, northwest of Sierra Leone, right? Okay, that's a huge rice producing area. So those people, they have the option to sell in Guinea or Sierra Leone, depending on a whole range of factors: prices, the road network, and the traders, how good the traders have been to them. Because these traders really provide a service in the rural areas, all right? So if you live on those border areas, it's easy for the rice to be sold in Guinea, or if in Liberia, in the eastern side of the country, coming down towards southeast, right? Again, they too use Liberia as a huge market. So we have these two competing ends, you know, Guinea and Liberia, trying to get as much of the produce. In fact, for livestock, literally Sierra Leone is the supply of livestock to Liberia for years, decades and decades. Okay? So that happens. The issue of the farmer, you know, the trader, then coming, these traders, they sit in strategic places and they understand the market. So they can come. I have very close experience with it, how they operate. When I was going to high school, you know, coming from elementary, so I just give you an example of how the traders operate. I was coming from grade 7, going to grade 8, that's for us standard 7, going to Form 1. Grade 8 for them, Form 1. So my family had used our money, family money, to send an uncle to America. So there was no money left, and I had to go start Form 1. So my dad said, "Oh, Joseph, well, you just repeat class 7. Then you go to Form 1 next year. Let me just show you how the traders work. See, this dynamics is playing in a village, right? And there is a businesswoman, a trader, local trader, listening, hearing the conversation. So my mother said, "Oh, no. My son has to go to college, you know, to Form 1. So my mother went to the trader to loan money. And the lady said, "Oh no, the money I have, I can't loan it to you. It's for buying produce." Now, the closer you are, the more the need you have, the higher the interest rate. I needed my parents needed the money because schools are open. I need to go to school. So my mother went crying to this woman. The woman said, "The money I have is for buying agricultural produce." My mother sold her whole peanut harvest for 10% of the whole year's price. 10% in order to send me to school. So this is how they replicate. So literally, we worked for the whole year for 10% of what we could have got in order for me to go to Form 1. That's how I went to school. And this story is repeated all over the country. The women, the business people, the traders, they know how to, how to do this thing. So they look at you, they are local. Some of them, they live far away, but they have representatives. So they come and drop the money. When I was in Sierra Leone, I went in July, people were asking me to give money out so they can go buy agricultural produce at a very, very cheap price. And I said, why? I said, oh, you have the money, so we can buy, gobble up all this produce, and then we sell it later when the price is high. And I said, well, but you're taking it for somebody else. They said, oh, is that the way you think?
Any other question? Any other question?
Well,
Last question.
yeah, so just a comment. I think that there's quite a bit of increasingly work being done and looking at trying to analyze what is called either the border effect or differences in prices through time at the different, let's say, villages throughout Africa and maybe 10, 15 countries. And this data is showing that these price gaps remain huge. So when you're speaking about your restaurant seasonality effect, this is why one of the reasons why it's so important, and Brenton and other people have written books about these studies that are arguing that there are a lot of barriers that could be removed, man-made barriers that could be removed to have more integrated agricultural markets throughout Africa, but quite especially there's a lot of that in West Africa. So I think there's need to continue doing with sort of more analysis on these lines.
So you're saying fragmentation is...
They're huge, and this is at the maize and rice level, at the very detailed product level. These gaps are extremely high. They stay large and even very large among countries that are so-called integrated regional trade agreements, which means that these regional trade agreements, like ECOWAS and all the others, they're on paper but not in reality. They're not just the border effects, but there's more to it than that. But the integration of these markets is still
Yeah, I mean, in our roads projects, they're not really integrated even within Sierra Leone.
right. No, even within what they do in these border effects, they take maybe for, I don't know, 20, 30 villages on one side of the border, another 20, 30 on the other side, and they speak the same language. What is the border effect? What are the other effects? And even if you don't cross the border, these gaps remain very, very large.
And somebody, we were talking to some guys in the other area, and they told me that people are now using the cell phones to check the prices.
Sure.
On the other side, neighboring places to shop around where the price is higher, and then they move the product there.
I mean, some of our results on the roads, what I was talking about, between, there is evidence from our roads that search costs us lower where there's more telephone coverage. But it's still, I mean, there's still a lot of cell phone, but it's still, and I don't think that's going to solve the seasonality, because cell phone coverage in Kenya is very high, and they still get pretty strong seasonality.
Okay, let me thank, I'm not going to summarize, let me thank Rachel and Joe for exchanging with us results of work done and also plans for areas where gaps are to be filled. And we hope that researchers have taken note of some of these areas, and if they coincide with the kinds of areas that we're interested in, which will be most welcome. Thank you very much, and I hand over to Eric for the Liberia.
I'll just stay in my seat. I'm pleased to be here with all of you. Thanks for coming. Our program, as you might have imagined, many of the projects that are ongoing, both on the policy and the research front, have been stalled because of the Ebola crisis. And we'll have a session tomorrow, as you probably are aware here in this room, on the economics of Ebola. We'll be discussing those things in particular. The two papers that we have here, you can see they're more on the bureaucratic and regulatory side, which should be a nice contrast to the agriculture next speaker is John Spray. He'll be speaking about price control. And Tarek is just leaving. We acknowledge an intellectual contribution.
Good. Hello, everybody. My name is John Spray. I was an ODI fellow in Liberia, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. I now work for the International Growth Centre, so I have more bosses in this room than anybody else. And strangely enough, actually, two of them are sitting wearing almost identical suits. It's a little intimidating. So yeah, I'm sad Tarek left because I picked up this project from him. It's a really interesting project, a really nice natural experiment in Liberia, and actually a very rare example of where you can actually have empirical assessment of the effects of price controls. This is something we see all around the world, but very few people have actually been able to observe the effects of these price controls. So today we're going to talk through the motivation. We're going to cover a bit about what we expected from what would have happened because of these price controls, a little bit on the Liberian context in that regard. Then we're going to quickly look at the results. I should say it's very preliminary. We're hoping for feedback and hoping to kind of adapt the paper to make it a little bit better. And then we'll come up with some kind of policy conclusions before we finish. Actually, but before we start, in contrast to Ebola's presentation, I'm going to give you the findings to begin with. So, do price controls reduce prices? Yes. Do price controls reduce the quantity supplied? No. Do price controls have different effects when competition levels and different levels of markups are varied? So here we're talking about different retail markets and street markets and different levels of binding profit markup. The answer is yes. And are price controls a good policy option for countries with weak institutions? It's unclear, but probably not. Okay, so coming into the motivation now. As I mentioned before, price controls appear in pretty much every introductory economics textbook. These things are a staple. You know, when you go to Economics 101, the first thing you see is a graph with like a supply and demand curve across it and a flat horizontal line, which is where the price control is set. And we have fairly kind of confident assessments of what that's going to do, right? It's going to reduce the price and it's going to suppress the quantity supplied. And we feel pretty confident about that. But despite this, they're actually incredibly popular among public policy people. You know, there's very few governments out there that haven't at some time considered putting in a price control. That varies from developed countries, so we've seen this in the US, we've seen this in the UK recently with kind of energy market debate. We've also seen this in developing countries, especially when it comes to food price crisis. There's a lot of increasing pressure then to try and restrict the price of those food products. And that's a really kind of interesting response, and actually we don't necessarily think it's always a good response, which is why it remains a kind of contentious issue. Here I've just got to put up some quotes. Nicholson's undergraduate textbook, it's based on noble motives quite often, but it creates a lot of losses for both consumers and producers. It reduces incentives for producers. It's from an FAO report. And it can often be associated with government requisitioning, corruption, rent-seeking, not necessarily positive things you want from a policy. But the truth is, even with these very confident assertions that we can make, the empirical evidence is extremely limited. I put up 3 kind of sector-specific studies from fairly developed places, the USA, Canada, and France, and they're finding very kind of surprising results, not things we necessarily would expect. For example, in the first 2, they find that actually when price settings are set above the equilibrium market price, they actually end up increasing the price of the good to do with finding a focal point where firms could collude. Very surprising result. So what we're seeing here is actually that the story we hear in the textbook and the limited empirical evidence we have, don't necessarily match up, and we don't necessarily know what's happening, and especially when it comes to weak institutional environments such as Liberia, and especially when we come and look at different levels of competition in different markets. So Liberia's price, we all know a little bit about Liberia in this room. I won't go into great detail because we have limited time, but I think one of the really interesting parts of Liberia is the kind of the dual economy. And I think this is something mirrored across a lot of African economies, where you have kind of a sector of street markets, which is predominantly shopped at by pretty poor Liberians, purchasing kind of agricultural goods, like the staples they need to live, and those firms selling those are pretty subsistence. It's low profit markups, it's fairly homogeneous producers, a lot of them. So actually we're thinking this is kind of similar to a perfect competition model. Perhaps one of the closest things we see to a perfect competition model out there in the world. We can then contrast that with the kind of the retail sector in Liberia. So one of the classic examples is the supermarket sector. I think there's probably 6 supermarkets in Liberia, and they're run by elite business people, and there's very few of them. They're largely interconnected, some of them are related, many of them come from the same ethnic background. So I think, anecdotally at least, we're seeing that this might be a more collusive, more market power structure. In terms of Liberia's price controls in 1988, the request of Samuel Doe, they set up a unit within the Ministry of Commerce, which was in charge of setting prices of goods. Those prices were set based on a percentage markup based on the import price of those goods. And they had an algorithm, and those prices were published in the Chamber of Commerce and transmitted to business owners. It was on an enormous number of goods, and I'll show you some examples in a second. In 2009, I think the administration decided that actually this didn't fit with the kind of the model that they were looking for, this kind of liberalized model. And so they tried to remove all of those, with the exception of petroleum products. In 2011, they kind of went one step further and really kind of just said, look, we're stepping back, we're not doing anything. And that kind of resulted in just like completely free market, let the market decide what the price is. We don't care if they're polluting as long as they're supplying enough goods. To give you some examples, so this is on absolutely everything. So staple goods, milk, rice, fruit and vegetables, industrial goods, cement, building materials, machinery, and even, I put luxury goods here, I don't know if luxury is the right word, but artificial flowers, false beards, and musical instruments. So you can see that rice got a 10% percentage markup, milk got a 10% percentage markup, cement 20%, and if you want to sell false beards in Liberia, I'm afraid you'll have to be limited to a 15% percentage markup. It's genuinely true, I didn't make that up. Okay, so what do we expect? I think, in the paper we set out kind of six potential options, six potential models of what might happen. I'm not going to go into very much detail about each of those, and it's incredibly basic, it's what we do in our kind of introductory courses. But we're thinking, in the street market sector, that's probably going to be a little bit like perfect competition. We expect that actually price controls might affect differently in that sector to the retail market, where we might see some kind of oligopolistic behavior, perhaps monopoly behavior. And then the final one at the bottom is, well, maybe there's corruption and maybe the state isn't really capable of doing this. And then we see different results entirely. We would see that perhaps the price controls maybe wouldn't affect prices, or perhaps might actually increase prices. The useful thing from this is we get some testable hypotheses. And we can use the different levels of markup, as you saw before, false beards 15, cement 20, something else 50. We can see actually how that's affecting things differently. We can also see how it's changing across the retail sector to the street sector. A little reveal here. This is the graph, nothing complicated here, but the monopoly one, so we're removing price control, so everything's going the opposite direction to the way I've just been saying. So we would come here if there were no price controls. The price controls are here. We remove the price controls, we'd see price go up, and quantity suppressed. We may see that later on. Quickly, on the data and methodology, we use the Liberian CPI survey for our price data. This came across 236 different goods, surveyed every month, twice, both in the retail sector and in the street market sector. For our quantity data, we use import data collected by a private inspection firm, Bureau Veritas, which is enormous. And we had some difficulty cleaning that data, but I won't go into too much detail now. So this is actually probably our headline result. This is the effect of CN's removal. And we have two groups here. The red line covers groups that were never controlled. These are commodities that weren't one of the 333 goods, not false beards, but false hair or something. And so we indexed those to 100 in the first period, and then saw how they grew over the time. We can then compare that to the goods which did have this price savings. So coming across the average, what's the difference in the two groups? The first horizontal line is the first policy change, the removal of those price controls. The second policy line is the second policy change, the further liberalisation. You can see that actually at the start of the period, these lines tracked each other fairly consistently, but following the policy change, there's quite a big deviation in the two groups. So what the story this is telling us is that perhaps actually these price controls were effective in suppressing prices. They were doing the job that they were expected to do. That may not be surprising, but actually, given the state of the Liberian civil service at that point, actually being able to achieve something like the objective set out, suppress prices, is quite a big achievement. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing, but it definitely does mean that it was doing what it wanted to do. And that's actually quite a big effect. It's about 30% by the second period. Now we can see the effect across the different markets. So on the left-hand side, we have the retail sector. These are things like the supermarkets, the electronics store, which we're assuming are actually less competitive. And you can see a very similar effect. You see a big change from from the goods in the treatment group, the goods that did have the price controls and then the price controls were removed, much higher line, compared to the control group, the goods which weren't ever controlled. Yes.
What goods are not controlled?
So this is basically the Liberian government set out this schedule in 1988, where they laid out what they thought would be.
Also, there are no categories, examples. I'm just wondering what's in that red line.
So anything that wasn't part of those 333 goods. So I can't give you anything on hand, but bring up the schedule if you want. But it's just kind of all kinds of different goods. So instead, it might be some fruit and vegetables, for example, appearing in the treatment group, some didn't. In the street market sector, things are a little bit more complicated because there's a big deviation in the two groups at the start when there was no change in policy. But I think it's definitely less clear that if there was an effect due to the price controls, at least across this sector. So I think, at least intuitively and perhaps also in the data, we're telling the story here that actually, not unsurprisingly, in the retail sector where you have more market power, price controls are more effective at suppressing prices. In the street market sector, actually these people are setting prices that are already too low, or at least you can't really reduce them any further, and the government isn't really going to be cracking down on trying to get them below that level. Then we look at the different markups. So we broke the markups into 3 different groups, and these are the first periods after the change, and this is the second period after the change. And you can see that actually the effects of these price controls is biggest in the first period, in the tightest group. Again, biggest in the tightest group, and the effects in the kind of least tight group, the ones with the biggest potential profit markup on top. The ceiling is set with the highest space for firms to set prices. Actually had no effect when the prices were removed. Does that make sense? Then the quantity side. This graph, again, is a little bit harder to see. We can see this more in the regression results that we bring out. I don't want to go into the regression results, we don't really have time. But on this side, we're seeing that the quantity actually was suppressed. So remember that graph I showed you before? I hinted that this was going to come up. So what we're seeing here is that actually the treatment group, the goods that did have price controls, those were reduced in comparison. So what we're seeing now is that actually the quantity supplied of those goods, when firms were allowed to set their price at whatever price they wanted, they reduced the quantity supplied, and that artificially increased the price. So what we're seeing, yes?
So these are imports.
Yes. Sorry.
No, that's it's important, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's imports.
Yeah, so this is imports. So one thing that we're using here, imports, as a proxy for quantity. I think in Liberia that's a reasonable thing to do, given the amount of imports that really kind of dominate the market, especially when it comes to the goods that are covered by price controls. So what we see here is the firms were reducing their quantity supplied, and that was artificially increasing the price. This is kind of consistent with the story of the market, and that is showing us that price controls were doing something like affecting reducing the damaging effects of monopoly pricing. If nothing else, this is showing us that monopoly pricing is a problem in Liberia, and firms are really abusing their market power, and these price controls were actually reducing that. Now, I don't want to oversell that story, and I think it's important to say that price controls aren't necessarily the answer. But I think it is at least a very, very revealing statement to do with the power of the state in Liberia to actually affect change, and also the need to really consider these issues. Now, I promised Eric, I don't have very long, but I promised Eric that I would touch on some alternative possibilities for why this might be happening. So there's one story potentially that it's actually that they're just reducing the quality of their goods. 5 minutes, okay. Just reducing the quality of their goods but selling it at the price ceiling rate. In Liberia, we don't think this is likely to be the case because of the fact that it was calculated on a profit markup basis. So actually, even if your good cost more, you still were paying a price ceiling that was calculated on a profit markup. It's also potentially possible that the control goods were selected differently, and that's something you were touching on before. But we don't think that's a problem as well. We ran a placebo experiment 3 years earlier, where we pretended that there was a change in policy to see if there was any difference between the two groups. And when we ran that placebo experiment, actually there was no effect. The two groups looked very similar to one another, so we think that's less of a problem. It's also possible these trends are structural. There was some kind of cyclicality, some kind of seasonality, or international pressures. We again don't think that that's likely, perhaps because we managed to link these prices with the same data on the US CPI index. And when we did that process, we realized that actually there was no effect that really concerned us there. It's finally possible that perhaps this is something to do with loss leaders. So maybe we have the supermarket setting the prices at the price control level for some goods in the price control unit, only to make more profit in other sectors, and using the price control as a way to select that. Again, we don't think that that's likely to be a major issue because of the fact that the Liberian retail sector is so underdeveloped. And really, they're not competing on pricing, they're not flyering, they're not getting information out to people about the prices that they're setting. Okay, so some brief conclusions. In 2 periods after the removal of the ceilings, we're seeing the prices are about 30% higher than the initial value relative to the counterfactual of no controls. Quantities are about 18.5% lower than the initial value relative to the counterfactual of no controls. And the effect is strongest in these retail markets, the ones that we already thought were less competitive. The conclusion we're building out of this, the thing that we're kind of selling here, is the Liberian price controls are actually effective in suppressing monopoly pricing. But let's be clear, this is not a complete treatise to the welfare effects of price controls. The truth is that price controls have many negative effects beyond the ones that we can see with these types of regressions. There are short-term shortages, waiting costs if you have to queue to get your petrol out of the station, maybe general equilibrium effects, even though we're seeing good quantity in the long run, but still, I think actually the negative effects of price controls are probably quite numerous, and we can't really see those in this evidence. On the other hand, I think we're seeing a real impressive story of the effectiveness of the Liberian state, even when you have very weak institutions. I think we're also seeing a story of the uncompetitive markets in Liberia, and actually what that can do for kind of anti-competitive behaviour, and actually reducing the welfare of society. I think in the very least, I think we need to consider this to be a call to action to actually put in place competition policies in the Liberian government to try and address these anti-competitive behaviours. I know that's something that Axel has already played around in the past. Thank you very much.
We're fortunate to have Professor Jim Donello from the University of Geneva, who is no stranger to Liberia. And we're grateful for your discussion.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. I must say when I read the paper, when I read the title of it, I was not surprised at all by the subject, but I was quite surprised by your results. Let me tell you why in a minute. But first, let me just congratulate you on John, especially on a very nice piece of work on something quite difficult, because you are there dealing. You had to do quite a lot of data work just to get where you wanted to, and I think you did the best you could under very difficult circumstances. So let's say I look at the standard textbook, and the standard textbook, you presented it very well. although I must say, a little later, once I read your answer to the supply response, and you said everything that is supplied is imported, then I would have expected you to present your model not as demand and supply in the domestic market, but as an import-demand curve and a perfectly elastic foreign supply curve, which would have possibly been the better model for explaining the retail sector. But this said, if you hadn't given your basic results right at the beginning, I would have been quite surprised by what you found, because I would have expected that in a weak institutional environment that the price controls would not have had any of the effects, for which you gave your response, the answer to that. So I still remain surprised in some respects, and I'll give you a couple of comments to that effect later. Let me just say that one way we look at it in the Australian economists is you are in the third or fourth best situation in Liberia, so if you are in the second best, you try to go to the first best. If you're in third to second, here you're in probably fourth best. So the justification here is, well, you can't improve the institutions now, so since you can't improve the institutions, then you do the best you can and you put the price control. So perhaps that is the best way of justifying it. This being said, when you look at the results after the liberalization in 2010, 2009, second is 2010, right?
Yes, 2010. Yeah.
After 2010, when you look at the gaps everywhere, they stay the same, right? So essentially, then the markets are, quote unquote, integrated, right? So you have this, you do see the catch-up effect on the price side. Now, I think I have difficulty with some of the results you get on the quantity side, and I'll get back to it. And I think you yourself agreed they are not that robust. Let me just make a couple of comments on this, the import side. On the import side, you didn't have much choice, so you took this Veritas data. Now the Veritas data only takes imports that are over $3,500. Now when we looked at the data in 2013 with Anne, I think there were only 472 lines that had more than $10,000 worth of imports back in a year or two ago. So in there you're probably only hitting a very small part of the imports at that point. So that may be something you might want to take into account. The second is that you have prices on one side. By the way, you measure prices. You did prices. You deflate them by unit, or the government. They deflated them by. They didn't take the price index. They deflated them by unit value.
Sorry.
You state somewhere it's not price, but your price is the price. They gave you prices. Let me get to this. The price is. What was it? The price is. The data that came. The price is. I have to look at it, but it's prices per unit, right? It's not just the. So how are you measuring? Is it quality?
Each product had a slightly different characterization. Like a banana might be priced per banana.
Right, and they also address that. So if they take the weight of the cassava and then address that as the price per unit, yeah.
Okay.
But then we index that to 100.
Okay, no, the indexing is fine. Okay. All right. So, the assumption is it's exactly the same product that's being.
Yeah.
Okay. May not be the case, but I take it as the best one one wants to do. You go from HS8 level, Veritas is at HS8 level, then you aggregate it to HS4, which is the thing to do, by the way. As I mentioned to you, there's so much noise in the data at the HS8 level, you have to go to HS4. But then the HS4 level on quantities doesn't really correspond very well with the prices which you have, which is much finer data. So you're not really catching, I don't think you have trouble really catching any supply side response if there's going to be any. I think you should downplay that, maybe just look into the price effect, because then if really everything is imported, then or almost, or you should look probably into the market structure of imports, and I think that's what you said in the conclusion. Let's look at the retail and see what the market structure is, and that I think there's work that should be or could be done. There are a few retailers in Africa, ShopRite and others, where you could probably get some data and try and look at the product line that they are selling in different countries and see how these prices are changing. And I think that would be something very interesting to do in the future beyond this project, because there is quite a lot of room for doing some pricing to market. And the pricing to market is basically you don't have any exchange rate pass through when you change the price. And I think that this is something that you would want to capture. So when you're looking through the data, it's not so sure what you're capturing, but then the price changes will be different, right? And so in order to capture that, I think I would have preferred, I guess, if you could have decided, even arbitrarily, saying, okay, I have 200 products out of 300 price control. I'm going to divide them into 2 or 3 categories, and accept that these categories are the ones to consider, and just do the same graphs you were doing for each one of those categories, because those are, if you're talking about vegetables, even if they're imported, then there may be some domestic substitutes, rice or other basic staples, and then you could see whether it's different for the other goods that you have there. I think that's why you would get, one could get a bit more confidence in the results. So I have one last comment. It's on competition policy, and that maybe for the minister as well. I think for a small economy, when I teach, I always say, what is the best competition policy for Hong Kong? So do they have a competition policy in Hong Kong? The answer is no. They don't need it now. Of course, we're not quite in the Hong Kong case, but to some extent, having an open trade regime, can be your best competition policy. And this is something that's easy to say and hard to do, but it is something to be taken into account, especially in a country where, I'm not sure in the countryside, but at least in the capital, most of what you produce is tradable, right? Or a lot of it, at least from the statistics. So I think that this is something that one might want to think of. We have to discuss, the ECOWAS, TO, and some other things. Thank you for good discourse.
Maybe before we let everyone out, get some questions from the audience. Rachel.
So on the tax, one thing I just slightly worried about was you're putting in this big effort of measuring, and you're doing it as part of the study, and that's going to be done, therefore, potentially better and more reliably. So now I realize that's happening for both the control group and the treatment group, but just in terms of thinking about, is this replicable? I think you have to, if you get a letter after a very professional visit to measure your house, it might have a different effect than if you got a letter when you had, when the government tries to replicate it. So I think you just have to worry or think through a little bit about that. And I mean, I also worry about the issue of, again, maybe it's less true in the place where you're doing the pilot, but in general, surely a lot of people are going to be, if there's land disputes, you know, who does the bill go to? Well, it's not me, I'm just renting, and then, so I'm just kind of worrying about replicability of it. And just on the pricing thing, you talked about, you said that, you know, there are seven supermarkets. I mean, part of my reaction is, do I care? Like, why, you know, presumably these supermarkets are selling to, you know, rich people and foreigners, so yes, they're being taken advantage of by, but that's not, I mean, most of the price controls issues, you know, maybe they're having to pay a little bit more, but is it really, are we like really only talking about price controls in several supermarkets?
No, it's more than just supermarkets. It's all retail stores. So it's, you know, if you need to buy an electronic item, for example, which probably would be a negative effect on the economy, you also have to go to a retail store to purchase that. So, you know, if you're a librarian and you need a laptop, then you're going to, well, you would have had troubles with this, well, you will have troubles with market pricing. And the supermarkets was an example. It's covering a wide range of stores beyond just those supermarkets.
Yeah. So you didn't touch about taxation. So for the goods which are being sold at the retail in the retail chain, there may be probably like tax evasion story, which is like we are not paid. I mean, on street goods they don't have to pay taxes. On retail goods they have to pay taxes. So that's why you are seeing difference. Is that possible? I mean, there will be an interactive tax evasion story also here.
But they have to pay tax as well.
On the street also.
Sorry, explain the question.
In the retail chain and the street,
right.
It's like the degree of tax evasion may be different, and that is the factor which is driving it rather than competition.
But there's no change in that policy over the period. So, like even though there's the price controls are removed, but there's no kind of change in the tax evasion behavior.
But it's actually something that we should insert into the paper because the importer is going to have incentives to under-report on the one hand and over-report on the other hand based on duties and stuff. Yeah, so we should be clear about that. Andrew, and then I'll give it to our presenters to respond.
Okay, yeah, and I had a comment and a question for Oibola on her letter intervention. Have you thought through the potential for people to in the house to be illiterate, and whether or not a letter form of intervention could have substantially different effects for different households based on whether or not they're literate. If that seemed to sort of dampen the results, if that was the cause, if that was one of the links in the causal chain, that some households really understood the message, other households just never found somebody to read it out to them, and the message just wasn't clear. I mean, how do you think about seeing if the signal actually reaches the participant at the end of the day?
Are you both going to start?
Yeah, sure. And this is great because I guess one of the advantages of presenting this here is to have people like you in the room that can give feedback before we actually implement the things for this. And I hope to discuss with you all. And the other thing is, I don't see people from other countries here, but if there are other contexts where this type of work is interesting, I'm willing to talk more about that. But first to Rachel's question about how would this compare with if the government was running this through the madness calls. And so the typical process would be that they usually is first a visit to do the enumeration, and then the bill is run. So if we're following the same procedure, fine, our enumerators are trained differently, probably act differently in terms of all the issues that could be involved in this visit. And so that's one thing that's pretty different. One thing that's now we're actually having several months between the visits and the actual implementation. So in some sense, that's definitely the immediate effect of that. About ownership, this is not something that we can fully control because what we have is we ask when we're there, who was the owner of this house? and we ask, you know, is it a family member who says it's jointly owned, is there more than one person, both names are on the bill. And so when we do this visit, it's clear that it's for tax purposes. And so in some, they have to, before they can pay the tax, they have to actually show their some kind of land, property ownership. It's one of the registration procedures. And so it's really a thing that we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out, because what we have so far is their reports of ownership. And
but it's not the case that most of them are saying, oh, I don't know who owns it.
No, we don't know.
And you've got an address, is that?
Yes. A few people we get who are renting, but very few, less than 20 that said that say they don't know their landlord contact information. And back to the literacy thing, we collect phone numbers as well, and ways of tracking the actual owner of the house. And one thing, one part of the intervention is calling the owner to give this message again verbally, so that if they are not literate, at least they hear it. And we've done some pilot in actually being able to reach people on the phone using these phone numbers. And the numbers, like when we're there, we give it this call, you know, so it's somewhat accurate. So it's one concern we had also about how well people are understanding this messaging. We considered having without any murders that are dropping off the letters physically, we considered having them also like read and explain there, but worried about them kind of getting everything confused. So we just are doing this physical drop-offs, and then we would more comfortable try to get at this specific issue of people being able to understand the messages.
Thank you for your comments as well. Jim, on the imports, I actually don't think this is a big problem, because it's sort of a shipment that has to be below $3,500, not actually by the HS line. So a lot of these people are bringing in different shipments of different things. We have a lot of data. That's unlikely to be a big problem for us. Actually, using VLAC data has been helpful. The kind of the private company that has verification database that's made it quite accurate. This is the first time we've been able to get our hands on the full data set, and it's quite good. I think you're right about being a big noise in the constant side. It's something we try quite hard to address. And in our specifications, we run a lot of different options, different cleaning methodologies. But I think with all of them, we're not 100% confident. It's a problem with the paper and the difficulty with the kind of the nature of the study. In terms of the further study, I think it's a really interesting point. I think there's a lot more work that can be done. Rachel's point that actually, why should we care? I think there is still a case to care about some of this stuff. I think that actually there are dead weight losses affecting this. And perhaps you can see this in other countries and other kind of uncompetitive sectors across Africa and elsewhere. And in terms of looking at the kind of the staples you mentioned as well, we did try and take a look at this. Actually, our observations weren't big enough to really see any effects, we think. But I think there might have been a different effect across the different staples. One of the things I really would love to do would be to compare the imports and really disaggregate that by the markets that they were in, by the kind of different groups of importers importing them. Perhaps given a little bit higher data quality, we could have seen that, but unfortunately it wasn't really possible. I couldn't agree more that an open trade regime is probably the solution to this. And trying to keep your market open, trying to keep competition flooding in, that's obviously a key message that should come out of this. But it does also mean that we need to keep tabs on those importers and kind of mapping out that market is a really useful exercise that I think potentially somebody could get involved in.
Any quotes? Oh, yeah.
Benita from Ghana. I'm curious to know how this same approach can work in a non-organized section of a city, for instance, because you are looking at increasing property tax compliance. I think non-compliance occurs mostly at the lower end of the market, trades, organized areas, and whether you are looking at that as well. Because in our case, it's easy to get more compliance in the high income neighborhoods, very organized that once you go to the lower end of the market, then there are serious issues. Then you have mostly about 80 to 90% of the people, the properties in the cities in that category. So I don't know whether you're.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that before you can do any taxation of property, you need to have some kind of frame and registry. And what we're finding in Liberia is that even in the middle class and wealthier parts, we still don't have that. And so I imagine that even more so when you go kind of lower and lower. And I think it's a decision that will have to be made about how far down the tax authority wants to go. And I mean, there's a problem which faces this question of fairness again, because when you speak to the middle class, it's like, why is you just targeting us? Look at all the people. I remember being in someone's office and there was like a slummy area behind, and it was like, when you go tax those people, then come to me. And so there's a fairness. And so there's some different ways to do this. And some is instead of requiring the full valuation, and is to have something like a flat rate for those types of properties, so that you simplify for them, and then at least you still get that part of them contributing. So, but it is definitely a challenge.
Yeah. Have you looked at the lottery system for personal benefits? I have a vague kind of attempt to put people who are paying on time the first, whatever, 100, 1,000, put them in the lottery, and they get some kind of benefits on kudo, either a privileged approach to public service, or they get drawn in something and they get something. And I can't remember which country has been tested, I think.
So there's a study in Brazil, but that's not for property, that's for the VAT. But
Yeah,
it's a similar idea.
But similarly,
Exactly.
if you were looking for personal benefit, because I thought your personal benefit was not very exciting. I'm thinking of a private sector point of view. I mean, if you wanted to, I don't know, for instance, better access to electricity for a business, you would pay and it would be put on the pot, and then there would be a priority to the best neighborhood who have paid better, and then there will be prioritized in paving the road or giving them electricity or a hospital or a clinic or whatever. Something like this, so they see the return also. I wonder in Philippines something like this was attempted. Double check in your big IGC database. And also I wanted to ask a question which was a link between Sierra Leone and Liberia, which was, for instance, when these prices increase, did you see, for instance, new entrants in the market coming from the agri sector, providing to urban buyers, whatever they were formal or informal, street markets or supermarkets, high margin vegetables and fruits? Because I was surprised by the colleague from Sierra Leone that we didn't talk about this kind of 21st century kind of approach also to try to concentrate on the, sorry for this bad joke, but the lower hanging fruits, and we see this urban rural kind of integration as the urban population is growing faster. And I think IGC has done some work in Rwanda, I think there's been some work in Malawi, I think there's been some work in Nigeria, including Nigeria and Benin. I mean, how the Cotonou growers are serving the Lagos population. And for instance, if there is increase in prices, do you see suddenly a kind of new kind of vibrancy in the entrepreneurs serving this market, because the prices have reached a level where they can feel more comfortable, and then thanks to the roads that have been built, then they can serve a certain market. Sorry to be long, but I was trying to make the connections.
You made my job easy, so that's okay. Put it linked together in that way, and the first person out the door gets a free cup of coffee. Thanks so much.
But then there's conflict. It's happening spontaneously. Yeah. The first group, the fishermen. You go, I fish and fish, and the restaurants, they just swallow at higher prices. And increasingly, we see more and more processed and high quality vegetables.
I've never been in Sierra Leone.
No, fruits more than vegetables. You will get the better ones. That's interesting. You get the better ones not inside the supermarket, but around the supermarket. So yeah, it's
I don't want to influence your 60 million. If you were starting by something a bit, let's say, original like this, rather than the rice market, which is so tough to crack, with our experience in Nigeria and I'm sure in Ghana and so on. Starting by this kind of peri-urban little markets and demonstrate that you can have enabling policies that may help your policy makers looking at you in a kind of, oh, that's very, that's exciting. And then in 20 years' time, with your new offices, you can crack the rice market. It's just an experience of somebody who doesn't know at all Sierra Leone.
okay.
Sorry for that.
Thanks to our presenters in this class.
So that's a bit of tough part.
I record the camera on McDonald's. Holding the camera. I tell them, I stop the camera on I say, oh, you have the right to take the picture. I have the right to take the picture. So if you write bad about me,
The biggest city in Ghana is which has representation everywhere from Senegal to Nigeria.
Yeah, but I think Hospital was the big guy. There was a lot of this also believe more that Nigeria is doing it. It's not they're not on the side.
The thing is liberalizing crime, right? Once everybody loves it, the tariffs liberalized over time. So, for the CEOs, for products.
Yeah.
First year that
5 years.
Is it political will to deal with the loss of that?
Some activities made more labor, maybe the youngsters who are monitoring
maybe it's actually a good time to have what you're monitoring would be the most painful to do that monitoring. Does that make any sense?
We went and tried to find out what proportion is the trade between Liberia and Nigeria. Just for the ECOWAS was using the preferential agreement. In order to do that, you have to apply reform.
Yeah.
So sorry, I mean,
If it's legal trade, you have to apply reform.
Yes, I believe.
I thought that I thought it was not really pay my tax.
Very, very few.
But in France, because I'm French, I remember that in one being able to provide us with this information on the other market, there was a political issue, and then always increased. So a lot of people, they are just trying to explain this year we have
with the current
there may be something somewhere that it has I don't think it was a city, maybe it's a Corsica or maybe
free trade
there was the government at the time to
the application.
I do remember in a very nice to have a very nice trying to explain the money that we were paying on top of
but it goes back to moving move towards automation
and now
discretion.
fire
Then you can begin to say, okay, we are really hard.
Yeah, and we had this very nice presentation about taxation. And it's true that some people react differently.
You're right.
there are all kinds of things. There are companies that come back NGOs and groups like churches that want to prepare why it is important to pay tax. We always think about with NGOs and civil society on kind of
time of the year.
they ask things to the government that maybe the government can go down the other way. And as you see,
Because if anyone is went from finance, we will not be able to.
So I guess
Saying this was someone
net
who
result is
working in
not
another way.
exactly. That's exactly what but people
maybe
We sort of wait and see the first quarter next year. That's the important part.
No, I always wonder when it comes to I'm
and our team worked on the
I've always been from the small businessman
so next week we'll be working on that. We have
that's why paying local tax funds. Yes, we have even in Afghanistan, they are ready to pay local taxes from the local municipality because they see the shopkeeper, the guy, the small, clean everyone in the street. And actually, Kabul is the world they see some kind
yes,
of
I understand. Have quite a long list of
issues and so after that, you can in South Africa also when South Africa started from again
Me too, and that's like the
and Poland started to take over. You know that first in South Africa in the interest in any tax to the government because it was seen as a very small. And after that, after that also there is literature about
actually Sierra Leone
people who should they are paying taxes to this and that department.
Yes.
One of them pays something. But usually it's not possible
Yeah, 5 years now.
because there's so much to eat. But in some countries you
when you're back, how do you
service.
crazy projections.
NGO, civil society, but you should
There are two flights.
and then you go and see the business.
There's a tour of Africa
And then,
and Morocco.
let's say there are those who don't pay, there are those who won't pay, there are those who may have to pay.
Mondays and Fridays.
There are those
But
who have
screening is so intensive.
as your colleague.
I'm saying my statement I applied for assembly yesterday.
But
So I feel like I'm freaking bad right. And you go through all the screening from the Liberia side, and also you have to screen before you get on the road, before you get on the plane.
When they won't pay.
A lot of people leaving. A lot of people leaving, no families, liability, no families. As those numbers ramp up, it just gets scary and scary.
And so I saw the communicating as well, saying that everyone had to come back.
Yes.
So that you come
Run like
Well, yeah, I'm directly on the so I have this is one of the year recognition for related activities anyway. Yeah, so you know.
It's okay.
It's okay for yeah. It's one of those ministers that directly related to people. I just have to make sure that we have food supply.
Yes.
No. I still keep my Liberian passport. So there was a mix-up. I was in Ghana and I asked about it, and they said, well, you may have enough time in Ghana to go back to Monrovia, and then you're leaving for Geneva. You can get it processed in Geneva. Just one line through the application and send your passport ahead. So I did all of that. I arrived in Geneva on Monday and went there and said, well, actually, we're a processing center. We don't do visas here, so we got to send it to Paris. I said, well, I leave tomorrow. I leave on Wednesday. So anyway, our embassy intervened and, got a letter. And I said, yeah. Well done. I'm glad we finally get it.
No, excellent, interesting presentation actually. I want to actually, the investment government makes to collect taxes is one issue that helps limit our ability to collect taxes. And also the issue of compliance. I remember my aunt, I always tell people my aunt moved back in 2007. She had a big house in Singapore that was completely stripped. And when she arrived in Liberia, she met about 60 or 70 housewives living there. And so she spent a year negotiating with them to leave the property. Was not successful. Tried to use all the legal means, got lawyers, got Nerica Safe to write a letter, public works to write a letter. Was not successful. So after a year back and forth, you go to the States, come back, they will wear out, figure she'll leave in 2 months, and she'll go again, she'll come back. And the lawyer spending all this money. And then a friend of hers told her, well, you've been spending thousands of dollars this whole year on trying to get the city to intervene, public works to intervene, you're paying this lawyer. So why don't we just see if we can pay them off? So she started this negotiation with them, 15 families. If they come to a term, $1,000 a piece, they will leave. They need 90 days to leave, so struck an agreement. She paid them in advance, half. And then over 3 months, we began to move, and she paid them off. So they all leave. She closed the place, leaves, come back, hire a contractor, they start fixing the house. Literally everything's stripped. For months, going through renovation with this contractor who's like billing her like crazy. House is ready for moving. Taxpayer show. Clear blue day, she owes taxes for 20 years since 80s. This is lady in the 70s, right? So she would say, okay, no problem, give it a tax bill. Well, the tax bill is like 60, 70,000. You haven't paid taxes in the 80s. But, we can reduce it if you pay us, X, Y, Z. No, just give me the tax bill. So they go back and forth for a while. She's staying in my house the whole time. This Sunday I come out and he was screaming at these people. Get out of here, I don't know how you found me here. I'm going to get everybody any money. Anyway, make a long story short, she calls somebody in government who tells her, the next time they come, record them, get their names and everything, and we'll deal with it. So these guys come, they show up on the property, and say, well, tax bill is going to be about 50, but we decided to reduce it to 20,000, but you have to give us 5,000. And she records all of this, have a long conversation, and takes it to the then Minister of Finance, Anthony Sierra, who then fired the entire department. And then she negotiated a tax bill that was, a wave all this year. She was saying, okay, you asked me to pay taxes. You did not protect my property. It was completely destroyed, stripped of everything. Yeah, what do I get for the taxes I paid? What kind of reimbursement for all these people that have been living in my house? Yeah. So it's sort of that value proposition. It's like, yeah.
The other story that's always the nightmare is that I just bought this property, and here comes not one but two more people with a deed that says I also own this. Yeah, right. Yeah. And it's just as valid as the last one.
Yeah. Land issues is a big problem. I bought some property in each of the top people are nearly lost actually. 40 years ago. Apparently, the villagers have decided to resell that whole area. There was like seven of us bought like the whole stretch, the whole block. Yeah. On the entire Libasa Road, all that property was more like 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we decided, these people are abroad, they gotta come back and just sell it again. So you go to court, deal with it. Yeah, well, I paid my lawyer to do it. We should do it when the time comes. The good thing is, I was advised
for years. So as evidence of ownership. So when you go to court, say, I have paid taxes on this. Let's see your taxes. Your receipt for paying, payment on the property.
I don't think the guy understood that when he came back. Here to this point.
Yeah.
It's only what, just sort of wrote to popularize.
Yeah. But that still doesn't help the guy who wants to enter the market. And I imagine that has got to have big effects in Liberia. The guy wants to buy, wants to get involved, and then,
the market is
buy it 3 times.
Well, there needs to be a land industrial. But there's one in Rwanda that's been incredibly successful and would make a massive difference. So just had an investment policy working on it. Land Commission has been working on it for a while. Well, a lot of these things require such huge investments. The whole issue of I work now closely with the LRA, and all the things we're talking about, how do we improve revenue collection? Sort of, we need to put in the right investment to do that. It's a massive administration operation to do that. Pay the right people to do that, to do the collection, build the right systems to do the monitoring. All of that requires quite a huge investment to set it up. And then also tax culture. There's not too many people are aware of they need to pay taxes. Look at you like they're crazy. In most developed countries, you start paying taxes. From the first job. So it's built in. It's sort of a normal thing. Liberia is another thing. What do you mean? So building a whole system around that, trying to get you to understand the value. But then government also has to deliver on its end. Where I'm currently building, I built the road to get to the property. I sort of opened up the whole place. It's been like 20 grand just building the road, and now all the landowners have shown up. And it's like, okay, who's going to reimburse me for putting in the investment? So it's sort of those sort of things that I have to work out. Oh.
Yeah. So press conference tomorrow.
Yes. You had a one-pager or something for me? You emailed it. I emailed you. That's on the presentation of the trade session. I sent you a list of the bios of the speakers, and a brief summary of the paper, and some discussion.
I forgot my one instruction from Jeremy.
How far is this hotel in T? Sharon Cross. Sharon Cross. Yelman Hotel. Said it's 10 minutes from here.
It should be walking. Everything here is super close.
And then I'm supposed to meet up. You guys are welcome to join us for drinks. Promise Hay Market, one Suffolk place. You know what that is? You there?
Yeah, I was foreign here in New York.
Yeah. At 8 o'clock. 15 minutes walk. Okay. Just you go in. I'll walk with you if you're going out. Okay, cool. Alright, Eric. So
if we don't, we'll definitely see you in the morning. The one thing have media team found you yet?
Yes, I got it done.
Okay, so they told you about things like overwhelming. Did they mention that? Yeah.
So overwhelming?
They just think they have an eye for what reporters might take out of context and stuff. Unless it's a deliberate case.
That's why we prepared that media news, which has a lot of questions. I'm going to go over it tonight again based on minor edits. And then we just share that with them. So I would choose what I want to respond to.
That sounds good. Okay, well, so glad you could be here, actually.
That's